Hello and welcome back. This is Greg French. Today we're going to be discussing computer repair, Chapter 1, Part 2, Hardware. This is a continuation from Part 1. We're going to be talking about the motherboard, which is the main board or system board. Motherboard is the largest circuit board in the computer. It contains the CPU, memory, expansion buses, quite a few things, and we'll be looking at this. Grouping of categories, processing, temporary storage, that's the CPU, and the temporary storage would be the RAM, and then communication and power, how we get the data in and out of the computer, and we'll be talking about the power supply. All communicate with the CPU. CPU has to work with everything in the computer. Peripherals, they link to the computer normally through cables, but they could also use wireless. Here's an example of a motherboard. Here we've got the fan on top of the CPU for cooling. CPU is a component that has millions of transistors in a very, very small integrated circuit. And as they make things smaller and smaller, things heat up. So we need a fan in order to draw away some of that heat. We also have a north bridge here with another little heat device to pull heat away. And we also have some expansion bus card slots here. Down here we have the memory. I'll be looking at this some more. Here on the side, this is a side view of this ATX motherboard. And the ATX can always be distinguished by having these ports visible on one side. You've got ports down here like for the mouse and keyboard. Up here is a parallel printer port. We have some USB ports, network port, and some sound ports. CPU and chipset. CPU performs the data processing. The chipset are microchips, integrated circuits that control the data flow. Manufacturers of CPUs and chipsets. Intel, by far, is the leader. About 80% of all the CPUs built are by the Intel. AMD, as its major competitor, has probably about 15%. And the remaining 5% is divided up between others. Here's a chipset. We have a south bridge, which is located down here to the input-output devices on the computer. And we have a north bridge. The north bridge is usually right next to the CPU and right next to the memory. So it's going to be using data paths to move data from the CPU to the memory. It also will be moving data to the video card, which is on the AGP slot here. This is a diagram I like to use to show how this is arranged. We have the CPU up here. Connected to the CPU is the north bridge. Now the north bridge is also called the memory controller because it controls the data flow from the CPU to the memory. Also it controls the data from the CPU to the video. So this is really the heart of the performance of the computer. We need a fast video card, fast memory, and a fast CPU to be able to have a high-performing computer. Now down here is the south bridge. The south bridge connects everything else, such as the mouse, the keyboard, the hard drive, expansion slots, everything else that goes in and out. Storage devices. We have primary storage. This is temporary. When you turn power off, it goes away. This is where the RAM is used by the CPU. A lot of processing goes on through the CPU and the RAM. Secondary storage. This is where we have our permanent storage. So when power goes off, we don't lose it, such as the hard drive or CD-ROM or floppy. But hard drive is our primary secondary storage. It's permanent. An analogy to this primary-secondary memory relationship, it'd be a book stack in a library. Let's show you a diagram. Here we have an individual at a table. He's taking books off the book stacks and he's moving them to the table. Table would be a temporary storage, and this would be our permanent. So RAM memory is a temporary place, and then instructions and data while the CPU processes both. Primary storage. RAM, random access memory, temporary. It resides on the motherboard. There's three types of RAM primarily. We have DIMMs, dual line memory modules. We have RIMs, the RAM bus inline memory module, and SIMs, which are fairly old technology, single inline memory modules. The RAM again is volatile. Data does not persist. It goes away if you remove power. There's also another type called ROM, read-only memory. This is what we call non-volatile. So when the computer first boots up, it uses a ROM device in order to read some instructions in order for it to be able to boot. Here are some slots on the motherboard for the RAM to come into. Primarily DIMM slots. Secondary storage, hard drive. Disks that rotate at high speed. So the hard drive is a device that is subject to failure because it does rotate at a very high speed. It gets very hot. Bearings fail, and they fail after a year or two. Could be sooner, depending on how well you maintain your hard drive. We'll be talking about defragging the hard drive. Hard drives slow down, computers slow down because of fragmentation problems. ATA, or the AT attachment standard, specifies motherboard hard drive interface. Types, we have serial and we have parallel. Parallel accommodates up to 4 IDE devices. Here's an example of a hard drive with a cover removed. You see there's a big platter here. This platter is what spins at a very high rate. Now down here is a head. This head goes in and comes out. This is what reads the information off of this platter as it spins very, very rapidly. This is what wears out. Things just start going bad after a while. It does heat up. If our information gets fragmented, it becomes harder and harder for it to read. You hear drives getting noisy. That's usually just before they fail. Here's a motherboard with some 40-pin cables attached to both a hard drive and a CD-ROM. 2 IDE devices, it says, connected to the motherboard. Secondary storage. Serial ATA is another standard. IDE devices could be hard drives, zip drives, CD-ROMs. Floppies. We don't see the floppies on the computers too much. They're only 1.4 megabytes of data storage. They're very temperamental. CD-ROMs are still very popular, being replaced most of the time by a DVD. Here are some connectors on the motherboard. The top one here is a 34-pin for the floppy drive, and then you always have 2 IDE connectors generally on the motherboard. Review. Motherboard, CPU, chipsets, and memory. We discussed all of that. Motherboard is our largest circuit board on the computer. It contains the CPU, the chipsets, and the memory. North bridge. North bridge or memory controller is what connects the CPU to the memory and to the video card. The south bridge. South bridge, or SB, or IOC, which is input-output controller, connects everything else. All your peripherals go through the south bridge. Hard drive, mouse, keyboard, other devices. Primary storage is the RAM. Secondary storage, hard drive. Primary storage is what we call volatile. It goes away if you remove power. Secondary storage, the hard drive, is permanent. You can turn the computer back on, you still have your information. Activities. We're going to have a couple of activities. I want you to do a drawing, a diagram. And on this diagram, I want you to include the CPU, the RAM, the video, the north bridge, and the south bridge. And I want to be connected properly so that you could explain it, how it works. If you were to come to an interview for me for a job, this might be something I would ask you to do and explain it. I want you to also complete lab 1.2. This is to identify computer parts in the computer. And then there's some questions I want you to answer. They're review questions that you'll find at the end of the lab. I want you to turn those into me on a separate sheet of paper for credit. Now this concludes Chapter 1, Part 2. Next we'll continue with the hardware, Chapter 1, Part 3. Thank you very much.